By the early 1990s, their double life had evolved into something unrecognizable. In public, they were the golden couple, stylish, charming, and admired. In private, they were partners in acts that defied logic and destroyed lives. Their crimes weren't spontaneous. They were calculated, rehearsed, and carried out with eerie synchronization. The disturbing bond they shared only grew stronger as they crossed lines that can never be uncrossed. No victim was chosen by accident. Each one was selected, studied, and ultimately manipulated into a trap set by two people who thrived on dominance and secrecy. They weren't just acting on one person's urges. They were united in their pursuit of control. What set them apart from other criminals was how methodical they were. While many predators act alone, these two operated like co-directors of a horrifying performance. One would scout. The other would bait. Together, they would record and relive the cruelty, finding satisfaction not only in the act itself but in the planning and aftermath. The line between real and unreal became blurred. They weren't just playing roles, they were rewriting the rules of morality, driven by a shared hunger for degradation. And it wasn't enough to target strangers. Eventually, they turned their gaze inward. There came a moment when the betrayal reached its most unthinkable form, the involvement of someone from their inner circle. A teenager, someone known and loved, who should have been protected above all else. She became the center of a twisted scheme, drugged under the guise of celebration and subjected to an assault that would lead to her death. They cleaned up afterward. They told the emergency responders it was an accident. Toxicology would later confirm the presence of a powerful sedative. The funeral was quiet. The couple mourned publicly, their deception ironclad. But behind the scenes, they destroyed any evidence they could, except for what they recorded and kept hidden, as if preserving a trophy. After that, their confidence only grew. There were more victims. Young girls lured with promises, strangers abducted in broad daylight, and even acquaintances who trusted them enough to get into a car. The methods were eerily consistent: drugging, confinement, abuse, and then silence. Some were released with no memory. Others were not seen alive again. The authorities were still focused elsewhere. The series of unsolved assaults in Scarborough had left police scrambling, and although suspicions had been raised about him, there was never enough to make a formal arrest. The DNA backlog at the time created a gap, one that the couple exploited to full effect. They moved between cities, changed routines, and kept up the illusion. But while they blended in, they continued documenting what they were doing. Hours of footage. Casual conversations in between unspeakable acts. Laughter echoing through dark rooms. It wasn't about compulsion, it was about collaboration. Their final known victim was a high school student who had been walking home alone. She was abducted, held for days, and subjected to psychological torment. There was no mercy. When they were finished, her life was ended and her body was dumped. The cruelty didn't shock them anymore, it was routine. In the aftermath of that murder, the investigation began to close in. A witness provided a vehicle description. A sketch was released. Meanwhile, forensic labs finally matched biological evidence from a years-old assault to a name. It was him. But by then, the violence had already spiraled far beyond sexual assault. When investigators searched their home, they found carefully stored recordings hidden in plain sight. What they saw forced them to stop the viewing sessions multiple times. Even seasoned officers described it as the most disturbing footage they'd ever witnessed. These weren't crimes committed in a moment of rage. They were acts of cruelty carried out by people who smiled as they filmed. The woman who had once claimed to be a victim of abuse now appeared as a willing participant, administering substances, instructing the camera, and laughing during moments of horror. Her earlier statements no longer aligned with what was plainly visible. But the law had already moved. She had struck a deal, a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. At the time, the full extent of her role had not been known. Once the tapes emerged, the prosecution's hands were tied. The public felt betrayed. Legal experts called it one of the most controversial plea bargains in the country's history. The fallout was immediate. Media outlets played courtroom sketches and photographs of the couple. The term, Ken and Barbie Killers, was coined, drawing on their polished appearance and grotesque contrast to the crimes they had committed. The name stuck. It became a shorthand for the unnerving truth, that predators could look picture-perfect and still commit atrocities behind closed doors. She served 12 years. He faced multiple charges and was handed life behind bars with no realistic chance of parole. The recording sealed his fate. The testimony sealed hers. And the victims, whose names rarely made headlines, became shadows in a story dominated by two people who had turned companionship into destruction. The justice system was forced to reckon with itself. Delays in testing evidence, the ease with which they manipulated those around them, and the legal maneuvering that led to her early release all pointed to a failure of process. Reforms followed, but for many, it was too little, too late. Behind bars, he remained largely silent. She attempted to rebuild her life under a new identity. But neither could truly escape the legacy of what they had done. Because what haunted the nation wasn't just the violence, it was that it took two to make it happen. And that neither one stopped the other. To outsiders, they were the epitome of charm. A golden-haired young woman with a bright smile and a tall, clean-cut man who seemed born for the spotlight. They looked like a couple out of a catalogue, perfectly matched, effortlessly magnetic. Friends called them inseparable. The press, years later, would dub them the Ken and Barbie Killers. But beneath the designer veneer lay a disturbing truth. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka were not just partners in love, they were united by something far darker. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born in 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario. On paper, his life seemed conventional, even privileged. But inside the home, dysfunction thrived. His father had been charged with disturbing offenses, and Paul himself showed early signs of manipulation and cruelty. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already developed an appetite for power and domination, traits he learned to hide behind a carefully cultivated image of boyish charm and ambition. By the late 1980s, a wave of assaults plagued the Scarborough area. Young women reported being attacked near bus stops or on quiet streets. The attacker was methodical, confident, and terrifyingly composed. Police created a profile: tall, well-groomed, seemingly polite, yet capable of sudden, calculated violence. The attacker soon became known in the press as the Scarborough Rapist. Though police gathered multiple DNA samples during their investigation, including one from Bernardo himself in 1990, processing delays allowed him to remain at large. During that time, he grew bolder, and his crimes more aggressive. In October 1987, Bernardo met Karla Homolka at a hotel conference in Niagara Falls. She was just 17, working as a veterinary assistant, and captivated by Paul's polished demeanor. The attraction was instant. What followed was a whirlwind relationship, one fueled by obsession, dominance, and a shared detachment from empathy. Paul wasn't merely a controlling boyfriend, he shaped Karla into an accomplice. And Karla, far from a passive participant, embraced her role in his escalating fantasies. By the time Paul moved into the Homolka household, the dynamic had turned toxic. He was increasingly controlling and violent. Karla, rather than pulling away, became more invested. The pair fed off each other's darkness, developing a world where cruelty became normalized. And when Paul began lamenting Karla's lack of innocence, she proposed a horrific solution: her younger sister. Tammy Homolka was 15, bubbly, and adored her older sister. She had no reason to be suspicious when Karla offered her drinks at a family gathering in December 1990. What followed was a medical emergency that ended Tammy's life. The cause was officially listed as accidental, a tragic combination of alcohol and sleeping aids. But the full truth wouldn't come to light until years later. Behind closed doors, Paul and Karla had crossed a line that could never be undone. Despite Tammy's sudden death, the couple's relationship continued without pause. In fact, within months, they moved into a house together in Port Dalhousie, near St. Catharines. The picture they painted was one of domestic normalcy: white picket fences, a golden retriever, barbecues with neighbors. But behind closed doors, Paul's violence escalated, and Karla remained a willing partner. Their crimes became more premeditated. Paul no longer relied solely on random opportunity. With Karla's assistance, he began targeting specific victims. Young women were lured under false pretenses, some with offers of help, others through Karla's feigned friendship. Inside the house, they faced hours of fear and degradation, often recorded on camera, their trauma preserved for the couple's gratification. The pair functioned in complete sync, Paul as the aggressor, Karla as the enabler. In June 1991, their methods turned lethal again. Leslie Mahaffey, 14, was last seen trying to get into her house late at night after curfew. It was then that she encountered Paul. What happened over the next 24 hours remains one of Canada's most horrifying cases. Paul and Karla brought her to their home, where they documented their abuse in chilling detail. The next day, Leslie was dead. They dismembered her body and encased the remains in concrete. Days later, the blocks were dumped into Lake Gibson, only to be discovered by fishermen shortly after. The community mourned deeply, but police had no viable leads. The mystery of Leslie's disappearance and the grotesque nature of her death stunned the public, but no one suspected the attractive young couple living quietly just miles away. Months passed before they struck again. In April 1992, Kristen French, a 15-year-old honor student, was walking home from school in broad daylight when she was approached by Karla holding a map. Witnesses later recalled seeing a car stopped on the side of the road and Kristen stepping forward to help. What she didn't know was that Paul was waiting nearby. In seconds, she was forced into the car. Her captivity lasted 3 days. What happened during that time would be revealed in court documents and videos, material so disturbing that only a limited number of people were ever permitted to view them. Kristen's life ended on the third day. Her body was discarded in a ditch, her hair crudely cut, her final moments marked by torment. Still, Paul and Carla maintained appearances. They attended Easter dinner with family just hours after Kristen's murder. They laughed, passed plates of food, and acted as though nothing had happened. It was this ability to blend in, to mimic normalcy so flawlessly, that made them so dangerous. Meanwhile, police were finally closing in. A woman came forward accusing Paul of domestic violence. Hospital staff, concerned by Carla's visible injuries, raised questions. Under scrutiny, Carla began to crack. She agreed to testify against Paul in exchange for a reduced sentence, a decision that would later ignite nationwide outrage. In February 1993, Paul was arrested. Soon after, Carla began revealing the extent of their crimes. But what truly stunned investigators were the videotapes, hidden in the ceiling of their Port Dalhousie home. The recordings documented the truth, and with them came irrefutable evidence of both their involvement. Suddenly, the public image of Carla as a battered spouse shifted. The footage showed her not as a hostage, but as an active participant. Yet her plea deal was already finalized, 12 years in prison. In exchange for helping convict Paul Bernardo, she would serve barely more than a decade. Paul, on the other hand, would face multiple charges of murder, assault, and abduction. The fairy tale was over. The illusion of beauty, innocence, and love had been shattered by the tapes, the testimonies, and the faces of the victims whose lives had been stolen by the pair the media now called the Ken and Barbie Killers. The trial wasn't just a formality, it was a reckoning. By the time the recording surfaced, the world had already begun to shift its view of the smiling couple who once seemed so harmless. Now, the footage made it undeniable, this wasn't the story of a victimized woman and her violent partner. It was something more chilling, a coordinated campaign of cruelty waged by two people who had turned their relationship into a weapon. As prosecutors presented the tapes in court, seasoned investigators looked away. What was captured on those cassettes wasn't just evidence, it was depravity personified. Each scene unfolded with calculated efficiency, each act committed not in haste, but in confidence. What shocked the courtroom most was the casual demeanor. They weren't frantic or panicked. They were calm, collaborative, and disturbingly pleased with themselves. When the charges were read, multiple counts of sexual assault, kidnapping, and murder, there was no gasp. Just a heavy, suffocating silence. Everyone knew the evidence had sealed his fate. But what remained unbearable for many was knowing she had already negotiated her exit. Her plea bargain had ensured a fixed term. 12 years. No parole board would block it. No new evidence could overturn it. Even when the videos were reviewed in their entirety, her deal stood. She had cooperated. She had spoken against him. And that was all the law had required at the time. He, on the other hand, was labeled a dangerous offender, Canada's harshest legal classification. It meant indefinite incarceration, no eligibility for parole unless a panel found he posed no further threat to society. That day has never come. While he adjusted to life behind bars, isolated and watched, she prepared for reintegration. With a changed name, new appearance, and protective orders surrounding her release, she emerged quietly, with many still unaware of her full history. But it didn't last. Journalists tracked her, dug into public records, and when her identity was leaked, outrage followed. Communities protested. Parents wrote letters. Schools posted warnings. She moved again. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were left to deal with a grief that had no expiration date. The trials may have ended, but the consequences lived on. In households across Ontario and beyond, bedrooms remained untouched, photographs frozen in time. For them, justice had been incomplete. 12 years felt like a bargain. A sentence far lighter than what the victims endured. He applied for parole more than once. Each hearing was a media storm, each denial a small reassurance. Psychologists and corrections officers testified that he had shown no true remorse. His statements, though polished, rang hollow. The panel rejected his applications every time. The public was never willing to forgive, and the system never forgot. Years passed. True crime shows retold their story in new formats. Documentaries pored over every detail, the psychology, the relationship dynamic, the failure of the plea deal. The Ken and Barbie label followed them, not because of vanity, but because it captured something horrifying, that people who looked so ideal on the outside could harbor something monstrous inside. And what truly disturbed the public was how much they had enjoyed it. The recordings weren't just keepsakes. They were trophies. Memories of a shared experience. These weren't crimes born out of rage or impulse. They were productions, directed by two people who loved having the power to destroy innocence. In time, her sentence ended. She remarried, had children, lived in quiet towns under assumed names. But the past kept finding her. Online forums tracked her whereabouts. Media outlets published op-eds, former friends gave interviews. Her image may have changed, but her legacy hadn't. For every new place she tried to live, someone remembered. He remained in maximum security, closely monitored. At every parole hearing, victims' families delivered impact statements filled with rage, sorrow, and refusal to forget. For them, justice could never be complete because the damage was irreversible. What was taken could never be returned. The case changed Canadian law forever. It reshaped how prosecutors handled evidence, particularly in cases involving accomplices. It forced new conversations about manipulation, culpability, and the thin line between submission and participation. And it warned the public that evil doesn't always look how you expect it to. To this day, their crimes remain among the most heinous in Canadian history, not only because of what they did, but because of how closely they worked to make it happen. Their bond wasn't broken by arrest, or trial, or separation. It was too deeply rooted in what they had done together. Some say she was under his influence, coerced by a man who used charm as a leash. Others argue she was just as guilty, perhaps even more so in her cold planning, her calculated silence, and her betrayal of those closest to her. What's certain is that together, they created a blueprint for horror. Their names are etched into criminal history not as two separate offenders, but as one devastating entity. A unit that thrived on control, manipulation, and the destruction of innocence. The world may never fully understand why they did what they did. But the evidence remains. The victims remain. And the shadow of what they became together still stretches across decades. Because monsters don't always live under beds. Sometimes, they live in the house down the street. Sometimes, they smile at the camera. And sometimes, they come as a pair. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. Please like this video and subscribe for more content like this.